Today is the Friday, 18th August, which, on the basis that the Ukrainian offensive began on the 4th of June, means that we are now 2.5 weeks into the offensive. We are also, by the way, edging closer to that period at the end of August, when, according to the growing views of a fair number of people, including, of course, myself, if Ukraine hasn't broken through, then by that point one can start to say definitively that the offensive will have failed, and beyond which, beyond the end of August, it's difficult to imagine or difficult to see how Ukraine can continue with the offensive it is conducting at the present time. But anyway, before I get into all of this, into a little in more detail, let's just discuss the latest information from the battle fronts. And it seems that yet again, this morning, over the course of today, in fact, Ukraine is launching yet another attack to try and capture Rabotino, this village north of the Surovikin line, on the southern front lines, which I strongly suspect Ukraine expected to capture in the first week or perhaps the first 2 weeks of its offensive, but which it has struggled to capture ever since the offensive began. There have been cases when Ukrainian troops have got close to Rabotino. There have been cases when Ukrainian troops have actually managed to enter Rabotino. And there has been at least one occasion in the past when Ukraine has claimed to have actually captured the whole of Rabotino. But so far, at least as at the time of making this program, it has failed to do that. Now, the very latest report which I've seen suggests that once again Ukrainian troops have managed to enter the northern houses of this small deserted village. They've been there before, and at the moment there's lots of pictures of Russian shells falling on the Ukrainian troops in this village, causing no doubt huge damage to the Ukrainian troops who have entered this village. And for all I know, the pattern we have seen up to now will repeat itself, and we'll see a Russian counterattack take place over the next few hours, with Rabotino brought again back under Russian control. Now, in saying all of this, there's also suggestions, a number of suggestions, that Ukraine has now set itself the target of finally capturing Rabotino by the 24th of August, which is Ukraine's Independence Day. And they need some victory on the battlefield to celebrate the anniversary with, and the capture of Rabotino, a small deserted village, apparently is going to be the victory that they're now seeking to achieve. So it could be that this attack will be pressed home with particular force. And there's lots of speculation in the media, in the Russian part of the media, that the 82nd Brigade, this last remaining Western trained brigade, which has up to this point not yet been committed to the battle, that this brigade will now play the leading role in trying to capture Rabotino and to achieve some kind of victory there, at least a victory that the Ukrainians can present to the world on their Independence Day. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But to repeat again, Rabotino, for all the time and energy and huge number of lives Ukraine has spent trying to capture it, is not in itself critical to the Russian defense system. The most important defense lines lie to the south, the Surovikin line. Up to the time of the making of this video, Ukraine has not reached those defence lines, and increasingly, as we'll see in a short time, there are doubts if it does reach those defence lines that it will be able to break through them. So anyway, another battle underway at Rabotino. We'll see what the outcome is. Further west, Piatikhatki, apparently the situation is quiet. It seems whenever the Ukrainians try to enter this now deserted and ruined village, the Russian artillery comes into action. Lots of Ukrainian soldiers get killed, and that they've not been able to make any progress there. Now, there is a lot of confusing reports about alleged bridgeheads, very minor bridgeheads, that the Ukrainians claim, or some people say, the Ukrainians have established east of the Dnieper River in Kherson region, at the base of the Antonovsky Bridge near Kherson city, and a little further north in close to a village whose translation into English is apparently the Cossack camps. Ukraine at one time appeared to be claiming that the Cossack camps, this village, had actually been captured by the Ukrainian military. It seems that is not the case. It seems that has never been the case. I discussed in an earlier video a report from a correspondent from Izvestia, a Russian correspondent who'd actually visited the village and confirmed that it was under Russian control. Anyway, there are some reports that the Ukrainians still hold these two bridgeheads. Other reports from the Russian side deny that this is the case. I've already expressed my own view. I think that what happens is that Ukraine every so often sends raiding parties across the Dnieper. They establish themselves in these areas. The Russians then retaliate and come back and launch military strikes against them. These soldiers are either killed or dispersed, but eventually Ukraine tries again, sends more raiding parties across the Dnieper, and the process repeats itself. That, it seems to me, is the most plausible explanation of these reports. Anyway, the latest reports that I'm getting from this area is that whatever bridgehead Ukraine had in the Cossack camps area has now been extinguished. There might be some Ukrainian troops still in that area east of the Dnieper, but they are no longer a significant or organized force, though apparently there are still some Ukrainian troops clinging to the area round the base of the Antonovsky Bridge. Anyway, that's what apparently is going on there. Now, on the Vremevka ledge area, the situation is a little more complicated, but not much. And we've had a number of reports from a number of Russian officials. And first of all, we have Yan Gagin, who is an advisor to Denis Pushilin, the acting head of the Donetsk People's Republic government. And he has told TASS that enemy forces, the main enemy forces, he means the Ukrainian forces, in Urozhainoye were destroyed by our heavy weapons, in other words, by artillery. They are currently having difficulty deploying reserves there, as our artillery controls the access to the area, hampering the logistics for the enemy and wiping out any approaching equipment or personnel. And there's also been other comments about the situation in that same area on the Vremevka ledge, this time from our old friend Vladimir Rogov, who is one of the officials of the Zaporozhye regional government, the Russian-controlled Zaporozhye regional government. Anyway, he has told TASS Urozhainoye and Staromayorsk are under our fire control. Russian artillery and aviation are working there. And TASS goes on to say that Rogov has denied, specifically denied, Ukrainian claims that Urozhainoye has been captured, and he apparently says that Ukrainian troops there are sustaining heavy losses, and that they have lost several hundred troops in the Zaporozhye area. I should explain that Urozhainoye and Staromayorsk, I believe that they are technically in Zaporozhye, but they are in the sort of area, border area between Zaporozhye and Donetsk. But anyway, according to him, Ukrainian forces have lost several hundred troops in the Zaporozhye area over the course of the previous day. More Ukrainian losses, in other words, there. So this is what the Russians say. It's their consistent account that Ukrainian troops have failed to consolidate control of these two villages, Staromayorsk and Urozhainoye, that they are repeatedly shelled by Russian artillery. They're under heavy artillery strikes, that they are not able to consolidate control of these two small villages, that they're not able to establish large forces there, and that this makes it all but impossible for them to press forward. Now, there's a number of maps that have been released showing in detail the situation in the Vremivka salient area, and they show that by capturing Urozhainoye, the Ukrainians have created something of a salient, a sort of advance into Russian-controlled territory, but that the Ukrainian-controlled part of Urozhainoye is now encircled by the Russians on three sides, so that it is a very difficult position for Ukraine to hold on to or to consolidate its control of. Anyway, that's what these reports say. So that's the situation on the Vremivka ledge or salient area, but Ukraine is still apparently making attempts to advance there. And lastly, we have a further report from Yan Gagin, Pushilin's advisor, and he says that according to our intelligence, the Ukrainians are once again preparing for attacks near Klashevka, or concentrating a unit in the Bakhmut area. So we're going to have apparently yet another attempt by Ukraine to capture Klashevka. I don't think even the Ukrainians any longer seriously believe that they can capture Bakhmut itself. Now, there's been a report in the Washington Post about the fighting, and it appears to be based on intelligence information, on an intelligence briefing, which has been provided to the US government. And the report in the Washington Post reads, Kiev's counteroffensive won't reach Russian-occupied city of Melitopol. And it goes on to say US intelligence officials don't expect Ukraine to reach the Russian-occupied city of Melitopol in its counteroffensive, according to people familiar with the classified forecast. Melitopol is at the intersection of two important highways and a railroad line that allows Russia to move troops and supplies from the Crimean Peninsula to other occupied territories in southern Ukraine. It also allows the Russians, by the way, it makes it easier for the Russians to send troops and supplies from, if you like, central Russia along the land bridge to the front lines, bypassing Crimea entirely. And we are further told that it is now most unlikely that Ukraine is going to be even able to capture Tokmak, the next town, the town south of Rabotino, beyond the first fortified lines that make up the Surovikin line, but itself heavily fortified, that Ukraine won't be able to capture Tokmak either. And we're told that even though Tokmak is only 30 kilometers away from where the Ukrainians are currently attacking, and we read that this grim assessment is based on Russia's brutal proficiency in defending occupied territory through a phalanx of minefields and trenches, and is likely to prompt finger-pointing inside Kiev and Western capitals about why a counteroffensive that saw tens of billions of dollars of Western weapons and military equipment fell short of its goals. And the report goes on to say that in the first week of fighting, Ukraine incurred major casualties against Russia's well-prepared defences, and joint war games conducted by the US, British and Ukrainian military anticipated such losses, but envisaged Kiev accepting the casualties as the cost of piercing through Russia's main defence line. But Ukraine chose to stem the losses on the battlefield and switch to a tactic of relying on smaller units to push forward across different areas of the front. That resulted in Ukraine making incremental gains in different pockets over the summer. Kiev has recently dedicated more reserves to the front, including Striker and Challenger units. That's to say, the 82nd Brigade, which is equipped with Striker wheeled armoured personnel carriers supplied by the United States, and tracked Marder infantry fighting vehicles supplied by Germany, and 14 Challenger 2 tanks supplied by Britain. But anyway, it then goes on to say, but it has yet to break through Russia's main defence line. And the article goes on to say, the path to Melitopol is an extremely challenging one, and even recapturing closer cities such as Tokmak will be difficult. And that's according to Rob Lee, a military analyst with the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Russia has 3 main defence lines there, and then fortified cities after that. It's not just a question about whether Ukraine can breach 1 or 2 of them, but can they breach all 3 and have enough forces available after taking attrition to achieve something more significant, like taking Tokmak or something beyond. And then the article goes on to say, the bleak outlook briefed to some Republicans and Democrats on Capitol Hill has already prompted a blame game inside closed-door meetings. Some Republicans are now balking at President Biden's request for an additional $20.6 billion in Ukraine aid, giving the offensive's modest results. Other Republicans, and to a lesser extent hawkish Democrats, have faulted the administration for not sending more powerful weapons sooner. And I've already discussed how President Biden is now going to find himself in a potential crossfire, caught between those like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who say that he's given Ukraine altogether too much and has inflated expectations about Ukraine's ability to defeat Russia, and those like, say, Lindsey Graham, who complain that he hasn't done anywhere near enough and that he should give Ukraine absolutely everything it asks for in order for Ukraine to achieve victory. So that's what we learned from the Washington Post, and it appears to be based on a classified briefing. Even if Ukraine does capture Robotino, and perhaps they will, their main problems at that point only begin. They've suffered very heavy attrition. The main fortified lines remain ahead of them, and the United States, its intelligence services, no longer apparently believe that they can break through. In other words, they think that the offensive has failed. And note how, again, the Washington Post blames Ukraine for the failure. It says that Ukraine was given all the weapons it needed to conduct the offensive, but that instead of acting in the way that it should have done, in the way that was agreed, resorting to combined arms tactics, however costly these were at the start, it reverted instead to penny packet, piecemeal attacks along large stretches of the front lines, which are insufficiently strong to break through. The Ukrainians, Washington Post newspaper strongly supports the administration. The Washington Post is already setting up the Ukrainians themselves for blame. They are to blame, and reading beyond that, you can see that it is General Zaluzhny, the general in charge, who is to blame. I said that this is also the message, that that article in Newsweek, which I discussed yesterday, that is what all of these articles, in effect, are saying. But note that there's nothing here in any of this commentary about the other offensive that is simultaneously underway, which is the offensive in the north, which the Russians are conducting, and where they are now approaching the town of Kupiansk, or at least I've been calling it Kupiansk up to this point. I understand that the correct pronunciation for the name of this town is Kupiansk. It's Kupiansk. Well, there we go. The Russians, as I've discussed in several programs, now many programs, are very close to, well, let's call it Kupiansk. They've been conducting an offensive in this area for several weeks now. They've pushed the Ukrainians back, and they're now well within binocular sight of Kupiansk. And there were reports yesterday that they've captured several more fortified positions on the Sinkovka ledge, and perhaps part of the village of Sinkovka itself, and that they're now closing in and preparing the assault on Kupiansk. An article that I discussed yesterday, a report that I discussed yesterday, says that it's premature to expect an assault on Kupiansk within the next few days, and perhaps it might be, say, a week away before this attack on Kupiansk starts. Part of the reason for this is that, unlike the Ukrainians, the Russians have been advancing on a broad front. They've been very careful to ensure that their flanks are covered, even as they push forward towards Kupiansk. And this has meant that having to advance across a broad front has slowed the pace of the offensive. But it is apparently continuing. Whether or not, as I said, the Russians do decide to attack Kupiansk, only they know. But I personally would be surprised if, having got so close to this town, they didn't make a serious effort to try to capture it. So that's the overall situation on the battlefronts. It's not changing much, or indeed at all, from day to day. And as I spoke yesterday, in my program yesterday, recriminations are now increasing. And there has been an exceptionally bitter article which has appeared in The Hill, another magazine, this magazine I spoke about yesterday, which is intended to, which apparently it's part of its readership are people in Congress. The name of this magazine refers essentially to Congress Hill. But anyway, this article by Jonathan Sweet and Mark Toth is clearly an attempt to push back against an earlier article, also in the Hill, which I discussed some days ago, which also acknowledges the looming failure of Ukraine's offensive and actually references the article by George Beebe and Jim Webb, which appeared in Time magazine a few weeks ago, and which recommended that Ukraine go over to the defensive and use the time thereby obtained to start negotiations. And this article is clearly intended as a counter to that, as a pushback to that, and as a pushback against any suggestion of following the defensive strategy suggested by Webb and Beebe, let alone the negotiation strategy that is being now discussed, as we have seen, across NATO. Stian Jensen sort of let the cat out of the bag over, but as has been already confirmed by that article I spoke about in Moscow Times, and which was discussed in that other article which appeared in the Financial Times, which I discussed yesterday. So the article, this latest article in The Hill, says that Ukraine is now approaching its 18th month of a war of survival against Russian invaders. It is on what could be a pathway to victory. It's not losing the war, it's potentially winning the war. And winning the war thanks to the assistance provided by Washington and Brussels. So Washington and Brussels provided support, and as a result, Ukraine is on a pathway to victory. But, and this is what the article goes on to say, the US has balked at the necessary transition that Ukraine must now make from defense to offense. And a lack of confidence in Ukraine's ability to defend that country has translated to an abundance of caution that Ukraine could lead NATO into a wider conflict and potentially a nuclear war. Thus, Washington does not have a winning strategy, but one that continues to feed the beast. And essentially, the point that the article makes is that giving Ukraine everything it wants is the route to victory. It would enable Ukraine to defeat the Russians on the battlefield. The article recommends basically a no-holds-barred war against Russia, with Ukraine given a blank check to attack anywhere in Russia that it chooses with Western weapons as well. And it says that this is the way to win, but it's not the pathway the West has followed, the United States has followed, the Biden administration has followed. Instead, they've been reluctant to unleash the Ukrainians in that kind of way, and they've never provided them with the necessary weapons in order to achieve that kind of victory. So we read comments like this: by slow-rolling armour, aircraft, engineering assets, and precision deep strike capabilities that Ukraine needs to execute a successful combined arms offensive, the Biden administration gave the Kremlin time to reconstitute its forces and build defensive fortifications consisting of extensive trench lines and minefields in depth across a 600-mile front. To win, to defeat the Russian army, Ukraine must defeat its ability to mass and sustain personnel and artillery. It is not enough to win the close fight in the trenches and minefields if Putin can simply replace his losses from behind the lines and continue the fight. Ukraine must be permitted to interdict the replacements before they arrive on the battlefield. That is in Russia. To achieve success, they must win the close fight in the trenches and minefields, together with the deep fight where the commander sets conditions for future success in close combat. It must be done concurrently to maintain momentum and create conditions for the breakthrough and subsequent exploitation. And apparently it's all down to Western dithering that this hasn't happened. And they make all kinds of extraordinary suggestions. Ukraine must be able to protect its citizens as well. It must be permitted to strike the launch site of drones, ballistic missiles, and cruise missiles, regardless of their geographic location. Now, bear in mind, some Russian aircraft, in fact, many Russian aircraft, launch their cruise missiles from deep inside Russia, from the Caspian Sea area, from Engels Air Base all the way there. And it goes on to say, in the case of the Mikoyan, MiG-31 aircraft and the Kinzhal 47M2 hypersonic missile, that means the airfields from which the aircraft are launched and where the missiles are stored. Interdicting the missiles in flight only defeats each individual missile. If you interdict the weapon system at its launch point or its point of origin, you defeat the capability and set conditions necessary to win. And then it admits that the Russians have showed no sign of letting up. It refers to the offensive towards Kupiansk as Russia's last gasp, but nonetheless as somehow proof of Russia's resolve. And as I said, it calls for unrestrained war, with worries about this escalating into a nuclear confrontation between Russia and the United States. Well, we mustn't worry, apparently, about any of that. I have to say that this is, I suspect, going to become an increasing stream of articles like this. I mean, this is essentially an article in the Simon Tisdall, David Axe school. Give the Ukrainians anything and everything they want. Do anything and everything you can to defeat Russia militarily on the battlefield. Don't worry about World War III. The Russians are bluffing. And if they're not bluffing and you find yourself in World War III, well, blame Putin, because ultimately it's his fault. That seems to be the message behind these articles. Do things immediately impress me about this particular article, and it's so consistent, so typical of the kind of articles we get from people of what I would call a neocon persuasion. Note that nowhere in the article is there any admission of the existence of logistical and industrial constraints. They want Ukraine to be supplied with apparently unlimited amounts of missiles, aircraft, ammunition, tanks, bombs, you name it. They seem completely unconcerned about all of the reports about Western arsenals of weapons being depleted. They show no interest at all in the fact that the US is struggling to keep up with Ukraine's existing artillery needs. It's only able to produce 24,155mm artillery shells a month, whereas Ukraine is using that number of artillery shells over the course of just 3 days. And they don't seem to worry that there's only a finite number of tanks and armoured vehicles and other pieces of equipment that Ukraine needs, that Ukraine needs time to train to use whatever equipment it is supplied with. As I said, limits don't seem to concern these people, which gives the whole article ultimately a fundamentally unreal quality. I think that all of these people, Simon Tisdall, David Axe, the two gentlemen who've written this article, Colonel Jonathan Sweet and Mark Toth, who I'm told is an economist and entrepreneur and a former board member of the World Trade Center St. Louis. Anyway, I think they all know perfectly well that Ukraine is not going to receive what they demand for it. There's been an announcement yesterday that the United States has now given the green light to Denmark and the Netherlands to supply old F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine. However, we're told that these fighter jets are unlikely to arrive in Ukraine before the summer of next year. Training of the pilots to fly these planes, Ukrainian pilots to fly these planes, has barely begun. I gather about 6 of them are currently undergoing training. It's widely acknowledged that a year's training on these aircraft is not enough to achieve full proficiency. The aircraft in question are old and at the limit of their useful life. There are major problems operating in aircraft of this kind on Ukrainian airfields. The airfields are too badly damaged, in too poor condition for these sort of high maintenance aircraft to be able to fly successfully from them. All of these problems, Sweet and Toth dismiss with a wave of the hand. They don't actually even acknowledge that they exist as problems. And I think this tells us also what they really think about the threat of nuclear war. They tell us that Putin is bluffing. They say that they don't believe in this bluff. They say that should not deter the West from providing Ukraine with all the weapons it needs. They feel entirely secure saying all of this because they know that Ukraine will never get all the things it needs, because deep down they understand that the West is simply not in a position to provide it. So articles like this are essentially a rhetorical pose. They aim to criticize the administration, to pin the blame for Ukraine's eventual defeat on President Biden and his advisors, by arguing that they didn't do enough to support Ukraine and were somehow intimidated by nuclear threats from the Russians. They're not really an attempt to affect and change policy. They're just basically the first moves in what you might call an escalating blame game. It doesn't mean that articles like this are not concerning and potentially dangerous. On the one hand, there's always a risk that somebody in Washington might decide to adopt the logic followed in articles, in these sort of articles. They might decide, for example, to deploy US troops or to try and experiment with no-fly zones and those sort of things, risking that armed clash with the Russians. But of course, if President Biden suffers political damage after Ukraine is defeated, and if the reason he suffers that damage is because a perception is created that he didn't do enough to support Ukraine, then in a future conflict, the pressure on the president, whoever he is, to do even more than Biden has done on behalf of Ukraine will be that much greater. And of course, the risks in the future, in any future confrontation, of the United States overstepping to the point of finding itself in a potentially catastrophic situation, those risks will only grow. It tells us, these articles tell us, the extent to which bureaucratic and political battles fought in Washington are now in effect shaping US strategy in this war. And they also tell us how it is always the advocates of more confrontation, more extreme positions in these political and bureaucratic battles who in the end win out. Anyway, there we are. We shall see whether these people get what they want, and we shall see what happens next. Now, there's been, as I said, more criticism of the land for NATO proposal that has been floated to Ukraine. For the moment, it's difficult to say whether the West is going to engage in these negotiations in any serious way. I still believe that the president himself is opposed to negotiations, at least to substantive negotiations. I think that his fundamental sympathies remain with the hardliners. However, Seymour Hersh has written another piece in which he suggests that now a split amongst the hardliners is emerging. He says that Jake Sullivan, who was ultimately the author both of the offensive and, by the way, of the Jeddah conference, it's interesting to see that Seymour Hersh has confirmed what I always suspected, which is that the Jeddah conference was basically Sullivan's brainchild, and that, as my colleague and friend at the Duran, Alex Christoforou, rightly said, it was intended basically as a victory conference following the success, the anticipated success of the offensive. But anyway, according to Hersh, Sullivan is somewhat at a loss what to do. Nuland remains a hardliner and will probably continue to be one until the end of time. But Blinken is apparently starting to have doubts. He's apparently been dismayed by the failure of the offensive, and he is one of the people who is now starting to consider the need for some kind of diplomatic way out. Whether there really is such a fracturing amongst the neocons, I have no idea. We'll just have to wait and see. But anyway, I suspect that overall the obstacles to negotiation continue to be overwhelmingly strong, and I still feel that it's doubtful that the negotiations will really get off the ground, at least not until perhaps early next year, when it will almost certainly be too late. Meanwhile, the ruble, as I said, for the moment, appears to be stabilizing. The Russian economy continues to be growing. And incidentally, I've seen some more reports which perhaps give a particular insight into some of the things that have been happening with the ruble, because it isn't just a case, it seems, of Russian trade flows. The Russian trade surplus significantly eroded in the first half of this year on the back of low oil prices and surging imports, and that the Russian current account fell from a very big surplus towards balance. It seems that for the first time since the 1990s, Russia's external trade conducted in Western currencies, dollars and euros, dipped into deficit. Deficits were not big. There was something like $300 million altogether, which, to be frank, in terms of the size of Russia's overall trade, you could almost call it a rounding out error. But nonetheless, it is a deficit. And given that the vast bulk of Russia's trade is apparently now conducted in rubles, and given that following sanctions, it seems that there is a general shortage of rubles amongst importers, it's perhaps understandable why converting those rubles into dollars, those rubles that could, those rubles into those dollars which could be found in order to pay for whatever imports were made in foreign currency and whatever debts Russian companies still have in foreign currencies. Why that put pressure on the ruble. And I suspect that this is actually a significant factor in what happened this summer, though not an easy one to measure precisely. But if so, then it is a problem that is going to be, I suspect, fairly short term, because the central bank undoubtedly does have a significant supply of dollars that it can circulate through the system in order to help importers and debtors who still owe debts in dollars and euros to clear whatever liabilities have been incurred. And as I said, with the sums involved, as I said, we're talking, I believe, around $300 million per month back, perhaps. This is not going to create particular stresses. But it's interesting that this problem has arisen. And, of course, the overall picture, the main story that comes out of this, is that it does now seem as if the bulk of Russian trade is no longer conducted in dollars and euros, but in rubles instead. Now, I think there is another factor which has played into all of this, which is that I suspect that, like most people, the Russian government underestimated the difficulties that China would have expanding its economy after the pandemic restrictions were lifted. I think the Russians, like most people around the world, including myself, by the way, expected that once the pandemic restrictions were lifted, China's economy would surge, that there would be a huge amount of pent-up demand, and that this would in turn lead to rapid growth this year, with a big increase in imports of oil by China, pushing up the oil price. Well, it hasn't turned out like that. Chinese growth has been much slower than everyone, including the Chinese central bank and the Chinese government, appear to have anticipated. And I think we're now beginning to get better explanations about what has happened. On the one hand, undoubtedly, there is a debt overhang within the Chinese economy. This has been discussed at inordinate length by far too many people for far too long, which is not to say that this problem doesn't exist, the property market in China grew too quickly. It's become oversized. There is a real problem of debt, of overpricing in China's property market. This is not a problem, by the way, that China is unable to solve. The obvious way to do it, given that we're talking about a problem of internal debt, is through a restructuring of debt within the Chinese economy. And I suspect that over the next few months, this is what we're going to see happen. Some people are going to lose out badly as a result of this, but people who are creditors and who see the value of the debts they hold written down, and they won't be happy, and some of them, no doubt, are powerful people, but the Chinese government and the Chinese authorities certainly have the power to see this through, and of course there will be, by definition, more winners than losers come out of this exercise. So anyway, that is one of the problems that exists within the Chinese economy. It's a structural one. It's existed for a long time, but it is not a problem beyond solution. There is another problem, a completely different problem, and I think it is unique to this year. And it is one which, through lack of knowledge of China and of its economy, which I freely admit to, I have previously overlooked. And that is that it seems that with the pandemic lockdowns having been prolonged, and with China not having the kind of cradle-to-grave welfare systems that you find in most Western economies, many Chinese people and Chinese businesses got through the pandemic restrictions by running down their savings. Now, China historically is a country with a very high savings rate. Partly this is a cultural issue, but also it is in part a reflection of the fact that China doesn't have a cradle-to-grave welfare system such as one finds in the West, which leads Chinese businesses and Chinese families and individuals to save money to get through rainy days. And it seems that, again, as one might have anticipated, when the pandemic restrictions were lifted, Chinese businesses, Chinese consumers, having run down their savings during the pandemic period, their priority was not to go out and start spending, as most people perhaps anticipated, as Westerners would have anticipated. It was instead to rebuild their savings, which is the reason why we have seen a fall in demand in China and why we're seeing symptoms of deflation there. Now, that is, I suspect, a more complicated and difficult problem for the Chinese government to solve than a restructuring. A restructuring, it might be massive and massively complicated thing to do, but it is something that one can conceptualize. How exactly does one get people to spend when they want to save? Well, there have been suggestions now from some Chinese officials that the Chinese government itself should embark on some great reflation operation. One central bank official has even spoken about China borrowing an idea from Milton Friedman, the US economist, and providing Chinese consumers with helicopter money. In other words, just giving money to people in order to get them to spend. Well, we shall see whether any of that happens. Now, one thing the Chinese government has done over the last couple of days is that it has cut interest rates. And one consequence of that is that, of course, cutting interest rates will make obtaining loan finance cheaper, and that will provide some sort of stimulus going forward to the economy. It also, however, appears to be having some impact on the overseas value of China's currency, the RMB, which has been depreciating for some time against the euro and especially the dollar. And on the one hand, I think the Chinese government likes to keep the RMB at a certain level, and we're already apparently seeing intervention by the Chinese central bank to support the RMB to some extent. But I'm also going to make a guess that there are at least some officials in the Chinese government who are not too sorry that the RMB is weakening, because of course this is making Chinese exports more competitive at a time when demand in the West is also low. So it's not impossible that at some point over the next few months we will see China start undertaking a whole raft of policies, internal restructuring of debt. Apparently there are already some moves to that effect underway. A major reflation. The Chinese government does possess the resources to carry out a reflation. It is nothing like the kind of debt that some people imagine, and it also owns very large overseas assets that it can draw on in order to carry out a reflation within China, if that is what it seeks to do. And in the meantime, the Chinese currency, like the ruble, is depreciating, though not, of course, to the same degree as the ruble has done. So we could start to see a very interesting picture in, say, 6 months' time. Perhaps a return to growth in China, not impossible. Perhaps a consequent surge in oil prices as China imports more oil to fuel its economic surge. Perhaps a further surge in Chinese exports against the situation in the West of limited and falling demand, and conceivably even rising energy costs, in which case Europe, it seems to me, would be particularly vulnerable, though the United States would not be immune. It's difficult to believe that if something like that happened, there would not be a further increase in anti-Chinese rhetoric from Western politicians. Well, we'll see whether that is indeed what happens, and whether that's how the Chinese government responds to the economic challenges that it faces. But I, for one, expect that anti-Chinese rhetoric is going to grow in the United States anyway over the course of the next year, as the 2024 presidential election approaches. And of course, if any of what I have said is true, then we can look forward to even more reasons or even more explanations why that rise in anti-Chinese rhetoric will grow and perhaps even reach fever pitch. In the meantime, of course, the war in Ukraine will grind on, and we'll see where and what happens there, and whether the Russians will launch this great offensive that some of them are now talking about and what the effect of that will be. But that will be the topic of discussion for my next program. I look forward in the meantime to you checking us out on our various other platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. Don't forget to go to our shop, buy yourself the great things you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those things. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. This is where I end for today. More from me soon, and have, of course, a very good day.